Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally ho.
Wow, this is a very special episode, a new series that we're starting with StarPodTrek. These special episodes, one by one, we are going to go through the entire catalog of Star Trek.
Yes, and we're starting our rewatch with the original series, the very first pilot.
The Cage. What was your first experience with The Cage? I think we both really had the first experience with the Menagerie.
Yes, the Menagerie in the 70s when I was a child. Now as a child, I do remember, like I didn't really notice that it was Captain Pike and not Captain Kirk. I mean, somehow it just escaped me because I was just too young to notice.
But it was one of those episodes of legend that somewhere out there in the vaults, there is an episode that we didn't see the entire thing of. We saw the bulk of it in the Menagerie, but we never saw its entirety from beginning to end.
Not at that time, no. The original pilot was turned down by NBC, and they insisted that another pilot be made. So this pilot was never shown for a long time on Star Trek when they were running the whole series from the beginning, back in the 60s when it first came on. This one they didn't show. It just became rehashed into the two-part Menagerie.
Now, see, I knew that this was something special because it was one of the episodes where my father would say, "Oh, this is a good one. This is where Spock visits his old captain." And so that was, I almost had my dad coaching me which episodes were worth watching or which episodes were memorable. But then in 1986, The Cage was released on VHS tape, and probably beta too, but we had VHS. And I remember going to Tommy K's video with my brother and being really excited and getting The Cage. I'm gonna, more than likely, it was probably on a Monday or Tuesday, because I remember they had early week specials. Rent one and get one free, or rent one, get one at half price, something like that. So we would go at the beginning of the week so that we can get multiple episodes to watch them. But when The Cage came out on video, that was a big deal.
It was. Many of the fans were so anxious to see this because no one had actually seen it. And because some parts of it were cut out when it was made into the Menagerie. So now we were getting to see scenes that we had never seen before.
Even the intro was a bit different.
It was. Yeah, some of it, it's like they used different scenes or something.
And the font was different. You could tell it was a rudimentary version of Star Trek. When we first watched the video, what was exciting was to have the introduction by Gene Roddenberry and him tell the story about how it was too cerebral and the network didn't want it. There are various other issues that came up. Mr. Spock was considered demonic. They didn't like the idea of having a woman being in first command. Things that we've come to love about Star Trek. Can you imagine in that time period it was considered a negative?
It's hard to believe, but it was the 60s and things were different then. Now there is another story about why they didn't like number one. I believe it came out in one of William Shatner's books, Star Trek Memories. And he said that the real problem with number one was that the network executives just didn't like Majel Barrett's acting, which to me is hard to believe. I think this was one of her best acting jobs. I mean, I loved the character of number one, and I think everyone liked her. We all wish she had come back.
Also, the character of Mr. Spock, we know that it went through a variety of changes with the character development. There we see a very rough version of the beloved Vulcan. We see him smiling. We see different characteristics. His hair is a little disheveled. The uniforms were different. The collar was higher, more like a turtleneck. I think it's most pronounced on Mr. Spock, the differences, because he's the only character that transferred over and continued throughout the series.
With Spock, Gene Roddenberry insisted that they keep him because he was an alien, and what Gene said was, we need this reminder that we're in outer space, and having someone look at least somewhat alien, it was just a necessary thing he felt for this show, which we agree, right? I mean, it was, I mean, yeah, there's no Star Trek without Spock. I mean, not in the beginning, not on this show.
Yeah, he became the figurehead of the entire franchise after he became involved in Next Generation, and when they brought him back to the Kelvin Timeline movies. I mean, when people think Star Trek, 9 times out of 10, he's going to be one of the characters that they consider. What's interesting as well is they were thinking about painting Spock a different color, like red.
I think they had tried red, and then there was also a greener pigment to his skin at one time. So yeah, they had different ideas. I think it worked out better just having the skin that was more pale, but he could still pass for a human if he put on a cap. Mm-hmm. I think it worked out better that way.
And wasn't Majel Barrett's character, didn't she try out to be green-skinned as well?
What I remember reading is that they put her in the green Orion makeup, and that was just for a screen test. It wasn't because they wanted her to play the part that Vina was, but they wanted her to do a makeup test, and she was just the person that got to do it.
Oh, interesting.
So she did that.
Okay. Hey, well, one of the things that I did when I was younger, and I know we did very similar things, is I would write down. I had 2 ways of logging my love for Star Trek. One, I had the Star Trek Compendium, and I had a little star system. I would, on each entry in the Star Trek Compendium, I made 5 stars. And as I'd watch an episode, I'd color it in to give it how many stars I rated it. But also I had this little notebook where I'd write down details of the episode. So between these 2, the Star Trek Compendium and my own handwritten notes, I was able to catalog everything I knew about Star Trek and to be able to follow through on the repeats and connect the dots with the Star Trek canon. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the entry in the Star Trek Compendium with regards to the cage. Now, most of the entries that give the synopsis are fairly short, but the one for the cage is rather lengthy.
Stardate unknown. The USS Enterprise is en route to the nearest Federation starbase for rest, recreation, repairs, and replacement of personnel lost during the exploration of Rigel 7. Despite the status of his ship, Captain Pike decides to investigate signs that a spaceship may have crashed on planet Talos 4. A landing party, including Pike, Lieutenant Spock, and Navigator Jose Tyler, beams down and is startled to find an encampment created from makeshift tents and old spaceship parts. A band of ragged survivors comes forward, led by a man who introduces himself as Dr. Theodore Haskins. He explains that they are scientists who have been marooned on the planet since their ship, the USS Columbia, crashed almost 20 years before. A beautiful young woman comes forward and is introduced as Vina, who was just a child when the ship crashed. Captain Pike is very much attracted to her. Watching his fascination are several aliens concealed underground who view the scene on a strange television-like screen. When Vina lures Pike to a rock formation to show him the secret of how the old scientists have survived in such perfect health, the aliens emerge from a concealed elevator, render Pike unconscious, and drag him into their underground chamber. Spock and Tyler reach the scene too late to help their captain. Meanwhile, the survivors and their encampment have vanished. Pike awakens in a small enclosure, fronted by a super-strong, transparent material. The small aliens, led by the Keeper, approach his cage and converse telepathically, angering Pike by their references to him as a member of an inferior species. Pike is transported by illusion back to Rigel 7, where he once again sees Vina. After that illusion ends, both materialize in his cage again, where Vina tells Pike that she is the lone survivor of the USS Columbia crash. When Pike refuses to perform as the Telosians wish, the aliens try to get him interested in Vina by presenting her to him within various illusions designed to spark his masculine instincts. A medieval princess, a green-skinned Orion slave girl, and his, quote, wife. The Telosians have lured the Enterprise to their planet so that Pike can serve as a mate for Vina, enabling the Telosians to breed a race of humans they can use as slaves. Meanwhile, as Enterprise landing party prepares to have itself transported underground. When the transporter is activated, however, only number 1 and Yeoman Colt beam down. The 2 females materialize within Captain Pike's cage. The Telosians reason that perhaps the captain will be more attracted to either of his crew women. Examining number 1's laser pistol, Pike finds it completely drained of energy, but suspects that this is merely an illusion and that the weapon is actually functional. He has discovered that the Telosians cannot probe into hostile emotional moods and deliberately assumes an attitude of mindless anger. Throwing the lasers to the floor near the concealed door of the cage, Pike sits and waits. As he anticipated, the Keeper attempts to remove the pistols. Pike quickly grabs the alien, and as number 1 holds on to the tricky Telosian, Pike tries to shoot a hole into the wall of the cage. He threatens to shoot directly at the Keeper, and a hole instantly materializes in the wall. The Telosians have been keeping the Enterprise people from seeing the destruction their weapons had caused. Using the Keeper as a shield, Pike and the others ascend to the elevator to the surface of Talos 4. Centuries before, the Telosians had wrecked the surface of their planet in a nuclear war and were forced to move their civilization underground, resulting in their increased mental abilities and their inability to produce children. After number 1 threat prize and the Telosians reveal the truth about Vina. She had actually survived the spaceship crash as an adult, but was horribly injured and disfigured. Without the aid of the Telosian illusions, Vina is a deformed, middle-aged woman. Pike sympathizes with her and asks the Telosians to give her back her illusion of beauty. Standing alongside the Keeper, Pike watches the full illusion that is the Keeper's gift to Vina. She is apparently walking happily away with an illusion of himself keeping her company. Back aboard the Enterprise, Pike refuses to discuss what has happened, and the Enterprise leaves Talos 4.
Great synopsis there. Very detailed. So what were your impressions of rewatching this episode recently?
It was... you can tell that it was made a long time ago, but it still looks good. It doesn't look too primitive. It doesn't really look that dated. To me, you can just... maybe I'm just too used to it. Like I've already seen it so many times. But I think you can still picture that it's a futuristic ship. You can still get into the plot. You can tell that, here is Pike, and he's trying to figure out what's wrong, and he had his scene with Boyce where he was having doubts about command. He's thinking about retiring, and then when the Telosians gave him the illusion that he had spoken to Boyce about, where he had the Orion dancer there, and he was talking to the other guys. That was one of his things that he thought he might do when he retired. It was a great idea to show, for the Telosians to show him, this is what you could have if you retired. This is one of your fantasies, and we can provide that for you. And he didn't really feel like settling into that illusion.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent because they did make some changes, some very obvious changes going forward into the series. Well, let's just talk about the ship, some of the changes. The colors. Remember the colors, how they changed?
Yeah, the most obvious thing, yes. From this pilot to the next pilot, yeah, they added a lot more color. And this was going to be one of the first shows to be in color on TV, because TV was just switching from black and white to color. So yeah, they wanted to add all the bright colors because they could, and because people could see them now.
And in the extended universe, the explanation was, well, what did they do to update the ship? They just took that steel gray and added some color to it, which totally made sense. So it still fits in the rest of the Star Trek universe. And we see some changes on the consoles. There were those gooseneck devices that were sticking out. Well, the answer is it was updated when Captain Kirk took over the ship. So they put in newer technology. They pulled out some of that. So the basic structure of the ship was the same. We saw that there was a little bit of change on the nacelles. But again, that's part of the upgrade that the Enterprise got in between 5-year missions. So it made sense.
A little tweaking in between, yes. And we're supposed to think that it was, the time when Kirk took over was several years later. Mm-hmm. But in reality, when they were making it, it was probably just a few months later, and they decided to do all these changes. But the changes did make it look even more futuristic.
Yes, this was 1964 that this was filmed, this episode, and we know Star Trek didn't get released until 1966. The casting of Jeffrey Hunter, I thought he was an excellent captain. If he didn't turn down the series for movies, that could have been Captain Kirk.
It could have been, and we've talked about this before. If it had been Jeffrey Hunter, the show might not have been as successful because William Shatner played it so much bigger as the captain, and with Pike, he might not have been as much of an interesting captain if he had done several more episodes. We don't know, but he just seemed to be, yeah. Well, in this episode, of course, he was supposed to seem more, a little more depressed anyway. So, yeah, who knows? You're right.
Yeah, what do I say? He could have been Captain Kirk, not the character Captain Kirk, but he could have been the beloved captain.
The captain of the Enterprise, yes.
Yeah, the beloved captain that we've all come to know. But he died tragically in 1969. So when it comes to convention appearances and memorabilia, there isn't a lot of him because he died so young. One of the sad things was apparently he was denied a lot of roles because he was too handsome.
Well, that's interesting to note. But yeah, that is something I noticed in the rewatch. Wow, I don't remember that. He is really very handsome.
Yeah, he's very chiseled and model-like. Whereas Captain Kirk, he has his own style of handsomeness, just like Leonard Nimoy does, just like everyone else in the show. But to a degree, they're kind of everyday men. Whereas Jeffrey Hunter is very striking. So when I read about that, I was like, does that make sense? And you look at the other male actors in there, and you're like, I could kind of see that.
You could kind of see that he was, the stronger leading man type. Even though William Shatner is very handsome,
tall,
he's
too.
known for, yeah.
Yeah, but William Shatner's at average size. I think the only tall one on the original series was Leonard Nimoy, if I'm not mistaken.
He was probably for the regulars the tallest.
But if you look at this episode in the cage, when Jeffrey Hunter's on the bed, his feet way come off the bed. I mean, he doesn't even fit on the bed. Other castings there. Yvonne Craig apparently auditioned to be the Orion slave dancer, which was curious because later on in the series, she would become an Orion dancer.
That's interesting too. They've had, I know there was lots of different talk about different people auditioning for different parts in this first pilot.
And obvious Majel Barrett. I mean, we say that no one else from the cast transferred over to the other series. Well, she as an actress did, but her character didn't. What about that transition going from number one in an unnamed number one? She was first in command, but we're never let to know her name. And then she turns into Nurse Chapel later on.
Yes, and so now Majel Barrett, as everyone knows, she was dating Gene Roddenberry at the time, and even even as I read that the network executives also knew that. They saw the pilot and they kind of said to each other, "Well, that's Gene's girlfriend." He put his girlfriend as the second in command, and so when Gene decided to use her as Nurse Chapel, he made her put on the blonde wig and said, well, the executives will never know that that's the same person. And also they had wanted, how they had wanted to drop Spock, and Gene Roddenberry said, well, I decided to keep Spock and drop my girlfriend, but at least I married my girlfriend, and I'm sure Leonard Nimoy would have rather have had it that way.
Other notations that we might want to keep in mind that the writing on this is absolutely stellar. We look at, it's a character study of someone who's gone through a lot, that is Captain Pike, where it enters into him doubting whether he can continue on being a captain or not because of all that he's seen, all that he's experienced. Now, through non-canon sources, some of them are going to be somewhat conflicting, but we're to understand that this is the second mission of the Enterprise. We know that Robert April was the captain previous to him, and Captain Pike now is taking over, but this is... He's had some adventures before this and had some tragedy. He lost his best friend in Yeoman in the last adventure. So now we're picking up as the viewer, seeing what it's like, him being frustrated, saying, can I keep doing this? And we see that his doctor is also his confidant. And this is a unique doctor because they didn't just take the characteristics of Dr. Boyce and transfer it to McCoy. They made McCoy his own person. But what did you think about that relationship with Captain Pike and Dr. Boyce?
It was good. So they had this friendship, and where they could share things and talk. I mean, the doctor came into the captain's quarters, and they shared a drink, and Pike just laid everything out for the doctor. So we know that they're good friends. And later... Well, the next doctor after Boyce was Dr. Piper, and then they had Dr. McCoy.
That's right. I stand corrected. You're right. Yeah, there was one in between.
Yes, I think that Gene has always wanted the doctors to be the more human characters. He also said that on TNG, he wanted Dr. Crusher to be the most human character.
Yes. I mean, Gene Roddenberry hit it out of the park. He wrote this episode, directed by Robert Butler. I was also impressed with, because they were just coming back from a tragedy, from a battle. We even see when Mr. Spock is on Talos 4, he has a noticeable limp. So it's showing that he had some sort of injuries that he was suffering from, but he still wants to be part of this next mission.
Yes, and that's another thing. I think it's more the way they did TV back then, where they wanted to pick this up at a time when the crew already knew each other, they already had a past together. Whereas new TV shows now always start with how the characters all met each other.
With some sort of origin story.
Yes,
which
that's
I kind of like this format better, because let's figure it out as we go along.
Yes, I mean it's a different approach than what we have now, and it works for some people. I mean, it's okay to see that. Like, okay, so here they are, and they're already good friends. They've already worked together for several years. Yeoman Colt in this one was supposed to be a new character.
That's right.
And so she was the one that was new, the only one that was new on the ship.
Yes. So we were introduced to her as well as the others as well at the same time. Very impressed with the aesthetics of the Rigel Fortress, all that they had to do. I mean, the matte paintings, they become iconic in themselves, that scenery.
It was used more than once on on this show. But it was a beautiful scene.
And also we've got some iconic adversaries as well, the Talosians.
Yes, the Talosians have been around. They've been satired on South Park and other shows. And also when I was reading that recap and it talked about the Keeper, one of the Talosians, that he was never called the Keeper on the show. That might have been in the credits, and of course they made some kind of action figure called the Keeper.
Sure. Well, that's one of the things when you look into the Mego dolls. That's one of the ones they never quite got right, because the Keeper looked somewhat like the Balak puppet, but then the Talosian ended up having like this clown suit on. So later on, Playmates did make some Captain Pike and Vina action figures, as well as the Keeper. So this episode, being a pilot episode, still did get mentioned in various forms of memorabilia. What about the phasers? How different they were?
They were a little bigger and had the part that you could turn at the end of the barrel, because that was what she used to make it overload. Which
was interesting. We look at it in universe, it makes sense. The military, the modern day military, constantly upgrades their armaments. So when we see the transition from this type of phaser, I don't think they call it phaser. Don't they call it laser pistol or something? They even changed the name of it, if I'm not mistaken. But when it transitions to the various types of phasers that we see throughout the original series, we just think, okay, this makes sense. This was, 13 years before the Menagerie? I think 11 years before the Man Trap. So it makes sense that the technology would be a little bit different back then. Sorry, I deviated. We were talking about the Telosians. Just the Telosians themselves, we got to meet Sandy Gimple, one of the actresses that played Telosians. It was interesting that they were all played by females.
Yeah, that was pretty neat too, but they wanted the characters to be small. I mean, that's what you notice about them, that they had the big heads and the small bodies. But there was one man, Felix Silla. Mm-hmm. He played a Telosian too.
You're right. Felix Celia did, yes. But they used like a type of pump system to make their brains swell. The veins go up and down whenever they were thinking. It showed a physical reaction to their mental prowess.
You could see that the vein in his head throbbing while he was talking. That, yes.
It's also been said that the cage was inspired by the movie Forbidden Planet. Well, you're going to have some sort of crossovers in science fiction. I mean, that's obvious, especially during that time period. But this episode, if I'm not mistaken, when I had my original Star Trek compendium, I rated it 5 stars. Because the rewatchability is endless. Every time I watch it, I'm still picking up different details about it that I'm impressed with.
There was a lot in it, because you look at the scenery on the planet and even on the Enterprise. There's enough there to catch your eye. Yeah, and if you wanted to decide one time I'm going to watch it and focus just on the background, and you can see so much there.
Especially we watched it, I mean, obviously the newer versions of it, the clarity is so much more. And as an adult, of which I never as a kid noticed it, but there's a bird-like creature in the cage. So we had an ape-like creature that anytime there's creatures in Star Trek, I get excited. So remember, we had the Telosian transform into something like an ape, and then in the background we see a bird-like creature. So multiple times, they put a lot of money into this episode. It's been said that this is the most expensive Star Trek original series episode ever produced, over $600,000, which was enormous for that time period. Let's talk about the timeline. Where exactly does the cage fit in the rest of the Star Trek universe?
Getting this from Memory Alpha, so we have the cage supposedly takes place in the year 2254. And then Where No Man Has Gone Before takes place 11 years later in 2265. And then in between there, if you want to know, like Discovery Season 2, which has Pike, it is in the year 2257. So when the Discovery Pike is actually after this episode, The Cage, but it's before, well, of course it would have to be before the Menagerie. And Pike was captain of the Enterprise from 2250 to 2265. So in The Cage, he had been the Enterprise captain for 4 years. And also, he served on 3 different ships before he became Captain April's first officer. So he was actually on the Enterprise as first officer before he became captain, which makes sense. And then after being captain of the Enterprise, he became the fleet captain. So he was a fleet captain for a few years.
So within time, I mean, this show's been out for 50 years. And if you're listening to this podcast, you know the outcome of Captain Pike. So we don't have to worry about spoilers. But in the Menagerie, we found out what really happens to Captain Pike within time. But there have been quite a few novels as well as comic books that touch on this era of Star Trek that we don't see a lot on screen. Pretty much just one, and then this is it, and the Menagerie. So we look forward to delving deeper into the other aspects of fandom where the era of Captain Pike is mentioned.
She seems to be real by the way she makes you feel. She's the only constant thing in a million different dreams. Sometimes she's green. You're not my hero. What are you doing in my world? You're not my hero. Why are you the one with the
And here's some other media that we hear Captain Pike mentioned in. He was mentioned in the book Enterprise: The First Adventure by Vonda McIntyre, Final Frontier by Diane Carey, Vulcan's Glory by D.C. Fontana, The Rift by Peter David, Burning Dreams by Margaret Wonder Bonanno, The Child of Two Worlds by Greg Cox. And he was also mentioned in the Mirror Universe. In the episode Mirror Mirror, they said that Captain Kirk assassinated him to become captain. And then he was in the novel Dark Victory by William Shatner, and the short story The Greater Good by Margaret Wonder Bonanno, Dave Stern's book The Children of Kings, and then also in the Captain's Table series, he was in the story Where Sea Meets Sky.
And also he was in a variety of comic books, such as Star Trek: The Early Voyages by Marvel Comics, Star Trek Annual Number 2, The Final Voyage by DC Comics. There was also an encounter with a solid image of Pike in Marvel Comics' Starfleet Academy. And also, IDW Comics had a captain's log, Pike.
He's actually a very popular character in fandom, even though, like on the original series, we only saw him in the menagerie to begin with, but he was used so much later. Also in the J.J. Abrams movies.
That's right, and even in the Star Trek fan film New Voyages, there was a time-traveling Spock and Kirk, and they tried to warn Pike when they were going back in time. So even though this one episode at that time in 1964, late 1964, early 1965, was considered not good enough to be on TV, by the time Star Trek did get on the air and did develop further, this one episode made massive ripples in the Star Trek universe.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.